Some soldiers who saw action in Vietnam will tell you it was not a war, it was a police action. Regardless of what you call it, 57,000 Americans came home in wooden boxes, and countless others returned with physical and emotional scars. Many veterans claim to suffer from flashbacks and nightmares that trigger outbursts of violence and periods of deep depression. It's called delayed stress syndrome.
Stevie, come down!
What you're watching is Hollywood's version of what happened to prisoners of war in Vietnam. It is not what really happened. The only pictures of what really went on are recorded in the minds of those who were there. And as the first group of American prisoners returned in 1973, those memories were all too recent. Colonel Sam Johnson of Plano was among those welcomed home from a prison camp. He spent 7 years of his life as a captive of the North Vietnamese, 42 months in solitary confinement.
An occasional nightmare is not uncommon among anyone. And I'd have to admit that I probably had my share of them when I got back.
But Colonel Johnson says he really hasn't suffered from delayed stress because of his education and because the government took special precautions with the POWs, helping them readjust. Being a pilot also made a difference.
There's a difference between flying and fighting on the ground. Although both of them inflict casualties and both of them deal with death day in and day out, it's a different kind of feeling on the ground.
Dallas City Councilman Lee Simpson was on the ground, but he says he was lucky. As a battalion radio operator for the 1st Air Cavalry Division, his closest encounter with death came by radio contact with troops engaged in heavy combat. Simpson says he has no emotional hangovers from Vietnam, but he understands how the tension of being on frontline patrol could cause problems.
I think that that kind of constant tension with the sudden explosions and the, and the likelihood of that produced a kind of a pressure on people that was unlike anything else.
Ron Weinzaffel knew that pressure. For 9 months, he survived the jungles of Vietnam as a foot soldier. There was a time, though, when he wondered if he would ever make it back alive.
The man in front of us had been shot. The bullet had entered his shoulder and gone all the way through his body. The point man was dead. But Richard, who was my very best friend at that time, said that we're going to get out of here. And from that point on, I knew there was a reason why I got out of that. Yeah, that's your chrome, and then you have your bumper guard over it where you don't scratch up your chrome anymore.
Weinzaffel did return from Vietnam. He became a successful car salesman and has won several top sales awards. He says he hasn't had nightmares and flashbacks of Vietnam because God has given him an inner peace.
And I think because of accepting the Lord, it totally changed my life. I was able to give my problems to Him. Where a lot of people have held it inside themselves, it's destroyed them.
It's been estimated that 500,000 Vietnam veterans have suffered from delayed stress syndrome. It has destroyed many of them and their families. So why have some been so affected while others have not? What makes City Councilman Lee Simpson different from, say, a Jim Hopkins who drove a Jeep through the VA hospital in Los Angeles and was later found dead in his home, an empty bottle of pills and bourbon nearby? What makes Ron Weinzaffel different from a veteran who became a heroin addict?
Now I'm just, an empty shell of a man who was normal, normal before I went to Vietnam.
Why hasn't POW Samuel Johnson been plagued with the problems that prompted this Vietnam vet to take on the police in a standoff at his home? Dr. Walter Pink is a research psychologist at the VA hospital in Dallas.
We don't understand at this time why the same fire that hardens the egg melts the butter. It's a very complicated kind of question to address. There are those who, before going into the military, who were vulnerable to stresses, and for whom then the war was quite stressful. There are those who were horribly stressed, who were rather strong by the time they got to Vietnam, who were heavily stressed, and there are those then who encountered stress after the war. And so it's difficult to find one sort of common denominator.
It is appropriate, perhaps, that delayed stress, like war itself, remains a mystery. There are no easy answers or solutions to either one. As Americans on this Memorial Day honor those who fell in combat, there are those among us who still fight a war within and wonder why. Doug Fox, Channel 8 News.